welcome to the penultimate set for this year. I believe it is. The next one is, this coming Monday is going to be a holiday. It's going to be the Memorial Day holiday, so we won't have Beck on Monday. But we will have a special Beck session on Tuesday at the regular time at noon, from 12 to 1:30. And we'll have lunch, the usual deal. And it will be Quentin Atkinson from Oxford, the Oxford Institute of Cognitive and Evolutionary Anthropology, and he'll be talking about the cultural evolution of human languages. I should also mention that we should take this is a graduate course and actually undergraduate as well. For those of you who are taking the course for credit, if you could afterwards grab a evaluation form and fill out an evaluation and return it to the Anthro Department front office, that would be great. The last thing I wanted to mention for those of you who might not have heard my announcement a few minutes ago, what we're going to do is, because the food is late, Carlos has kindly agreed to begin his talk, and Leo will notify us when food arrives. We'll take the briefest possible break of 5 minutes or so for people to run out and grab food who would like to get food, and then we will resume. So, without further ado, it is my great pleasure to introduce Professor Carlos Navarette from Michigan State University, Department of Psychology, and he'll be talking to us today on sexual selection and the psychological architecture of race.
All right, you guys can hear me okay, right?
Yeah.
Yep. Okay, so the title of my talk today is Sexual Selection and the Psychological Architecture of Race Prejudice. What I'm going to be doing is telling you about 3 studies, a little bit more than 3 studies, but 3 basic lines of research that speak to the general question of, how can evolution inform our various hypotheses about how we might expect racial prejudice to be expressed, and how that might differ between men and women. And of course, none of this would be possible without my great collaborators. Okay, before I get started, just want to let you know that if there's any clarifying questions, any issue at all, any theoretical questions that you feel that you need to ask, go ahead and ask it right away. Just jump right in. No reason to be polite. Just jump in. If you've got some broader, deeper meta-theoretical thing you want to say, or you're privy to some kind of information that'll completely go against my worldview, well, wait till you get to your office and send me an email. And also, just jump right in. I can bypass some parts of the talk if we end up running tight on time. It's better that we're sort of kind of clear on issues, rather than me tell you every single detail of every study that I've done for the last 5 years. Okay, a couple of things. First, I'd like to mention what, in fact, I'm not saying. Before we get started, I am not saying that racial prejudice is, in fact, an adaptation, evolved adaptation, but that, in fact, modern racism is an epiphenomenon, or a byproduct of psychological systems evolved to facilitate various kinds of functional behavior, including kin-directed altruism, disease avoidance, coordination among like-minded followers, cooperation within social groups, between group competition, in coalitions, and for predator avoidance, staying safe, coalescing together actually to stay safe from dangerous agents. Of course, none of these are mutually exclusive, and you might imagine that all of them might play a role, at least in part, in the mechanisms that generate modern race violence. But although it's a cultural byproduct, we might view racism as a cultural byproduct of various group level cognition machinery. We think that it can be, in fact, studied in terms of its underlying adaptive function. And to the extent that race bias is an intergroup phenomenon, we might think that its expression that expresses itself in terms of racial prejudice, that its expression is influenced by the psychological systems evolved to solve adaptive problems that differ between men and women. Men and women have very similar adaptive problems. Sometimes getting something to eat might be a very similar adaptive problem. Avoiding predators might be you might imagine the psychological systems might be very similar between men and women, but there's also other things actually that are adaptive problems that, in fact, men have primarily that women don't, and vice versa. And that should be expressed in terms of the underlying psychological systems that give rise to modern race prejudice. And so the relevant evolutionary processes I think that are important here are really sexual selection, both intra and intersexual selection, intrasexual selection primarily on the psychology of males, and intersexual selection affecting primarily the psychology of females with respect to predators. So you guys know the details of those, I won't really go into. Okay, with respect to men and processes of intrasexual selection, you might imagine that it's more likely for men than for women to be characterized by psychology of aggression. And this is because violent intergroup aggression is rather ubiquitous. There's probably been a long evolutionary history behind this general phenomenon. We see it across cultures, history, archaeology to some degree, and sort of the chimpanzees. And of course, we think this actually, the fact that it's primarily a factor or a phenomenon among males, we think it's in fact due to sex differences in variance, trade-offs between parental versus mating, investment. David Cosmides and John Tibby described this problem in some detail in a 1988 paper on evolutionary warfare. It seems sensible. So men are in fact more prone to risky competitive tactics to dominate, debilitate, or eliminate rivals. And risky competitive tactics, one of the most risky things you can do in fact is be aggressive. With respect to the psychology of the woman, we think that in fact might be undergirded by psychology of fear. Of course, psychology of fear underlies aspects of male prejudice as well, but we think it's going to be more consistently and primarily an aspect of the psychology of women. This is because males are the aggressors in intergroup contexts, and because of such a size difference between men and women are in fact smaller on average than men are, they're in fact less able to fend off these kinds of threats from out-group men. So just in terms of basic formidability differences, women are less formidable. You might expect actually when it comes to in fact intergroup encounters, they're less likely, they're more likely actually to experience fear. It's also the case that, as is all too uncommon in violent intergroup encounters, females are oftentimes the targets of sexual aggression. This is a specific issue that women have to deal with, certainly more so than men. Some might argue this really isn't exclusively a female problem. Okay, so putting these two evolutionary processes together, we can think of a way in which we can start crafting a general theory of the gendered nature of prejudice. And it goes somewhat along the lines as follows. Because men are primary agents of intergroup aggression, they're in fact the primary targets of intergroup prejudice, and that both sexes are implicated in its expression, again, for different reasons that can be discovered or found out in the workings of the psychological systems that differ, in fact, between men and women. With respect to women, we might imagine that fear of outgroup men would be characterized by fearfulness. prejudice against outgroup members characterized by fearfulness, particularly the fear of sexual coercion. With respect to men, we might imagine that their psychology of prejudice would be much more characterized by aggression, and particularly the kind of aggression that occurs when it's fused with the goal of dominating other social groups. Now, some folks actually thought this was rather narrow point to make, but there's actually been some folks that argued, and I think I agree with them, that to talk about aggression as a motivation is really doesn't always make a lot of sense, right? Aggression is a tool and generally should be seen as instrumental, and really should only be expressed when the outcomes actually match some kind of goal. So if, for example, if I'm an aggressive individual and there are, I don't know, a couple of leopards out in the savannah, I can be aggressive, but if there's no point for me in being aggressive, thinking that I want to kill, I have a goal of debilitating leopards, it would really be pointless to use by vulnerability or to risk, make good on my otherwise aggressive disposition to go out chasing leopards. In the same sense, if you don't have the goal of dominating other groups, you don't think that your group actually should be dominating other groups, well, your aggressive disposition should not be used in the service of being prejudiced, and anxious, and aggressive towards other social groups. So I'm going to describe 3 studies relevant to these 2 basic questions. Again, examining, investigating the differences between men and women with respect to fear versus aggression, and how prejudice is expressed. And these 3 studies go along the following lines: fear extinction bias. So when you learn to fear towards in-groups and out-groups, does the fear actually dissipate or go away just as readily towards in-groups as it does towards out-groups? Explicit and implicit attitudes, right? Consciously held versus relatively non-consciously, automatically expressed implicit attitudes about out-groups, and political preference, particularly political preferences that are laced with the idea of race, which is basically been the case with presidential politics in the last couple of years. Okay, so I'm going to describe this fear conditioning experiment. Again, the fear conditioning experiment is measuring an anxious response via skin conductance response, conditioned to both male and female, black and white images. So the participants are looking at pictures of male and female, black and white targets. And the unconditioned stimulus, right, the thing that's going to, in fact, reinforce the acquisition of fear towards any one of these particular exemplars of the racial group is, in fact, electric shock and white noise. So coming together as an unconditioned stimulus, actually, to engender fear towards the targets in front of them. And our dependent measure is, in fact, the skin conductance responses during the extinction phase after an acquisition. An anxious response, in fact, is been acquired. It's just looking at the extent to which fear goes extinct or not, based on whether or not fear was learned towards black male, black female, white male, black female. Of course, several independent variables that are necessary here, of course, are gender. We measured these in a pretest. Aggression, we measured this as the stable personality variable. These are a couple of the items. They're generally descriptive, but in fact, they're descriptive about behaviors. Once in a while, I can't control the urge to strike another person. I have threatened people I know. With respect to the group dominance, we use the social dominance orientation scale. In getting what your group wants, it's sometimes necessary to use force against other groups. Superior groups should dominate inferior groups. I think it's a good thing. With respect to fearfulness, we use a fear break scale. And these are a couple of the items. Before I go to bed at night, I double check to make sure the doors are securely locked, which again, behavioral items. Self-report by behavioral item. This one is not necessarily a behavioral item, but I've got a great degree of face related.
Carlos,
Yeah.
that was on male and female participants.
All males and females all took the same ones. Same items. All right, so with respect to, so that was, I'm just describing the variables we measured in the pretest. With respect to the procedure of the fear conditioning experiment, it goes somewhat along the lines as follows. We had 167 participants from Harvard and MSU. Mostly students, but not all. Reasonably good stretch of age. Mostly white subjects, some black subjects. And we paid them $20 or gave them a lot of course credits to participate in our study called Explore the Mind-Body Connection. Very California title. They able to come in and shock. But they got paid. So they were cool. Okay, and again, this is the order. We had to take pre-test questionnaires at first, and then they did this for conditioning experiment. Within the experiment itself, the race of the target was manipulated within subjects. So all subjects saw black and white faces. And in a sense, they saw either black and white faces that were all male, or they saw black and white faces that were all female. So gender is in fact manipulated, experimentally manipulated between subjects. A male target condition and a female target condition, with groups manipulated within subjects. Racial groups manipulated within subjects. Okay. Also, we categorized black people as members of the racial outgroup if the subject was white. If the subject was black, we categorized the white subject as members of the racial outgroup. Acquisition, habituation, we had a bunch of pictures, trials in which they saw these pictures were just flashing in front of them, but they could kind of just mellow out, chill out. Usually this participant pretty nervous. Rightfully so. And if they chill out a little bit, we give them, start shocking them. And I'll cause 5 trials. So an image would appear, and a shock mixed with black noise. Noise was like a slap. The shock being like a sharp pinch, trying to make it something like a tactile. Aversive experience, not unlike something like you would experience if you received a hard slap. They didn't get slapped across the face, sharp in the face. Practice. And the subjects themselves, we calibrated. We had the experimenters calibrate the level of the shock. In fact, to be at a level which each subject said subjectively that it was uncomfortable but not painful. Okay. Comfortable but not painful. So we're not Nazis. So again, I mentioned each subject saw all male faces or all female faces. Within each category, either black and white, participants received an electrical shocks concomitantly with one of the targets and not the other. This is a procedure pretty widely done within the learning literature. You form a baseline for the conditioned fear towards the category. Because there's a bunch of different reasons why people might feel more anxiety towards black eye folk, things like that, right? Even before they come to the experiment. There's, in a sense, we're kind of extent that we can't control it, controlling it. Where one of them is in fact actually never paired with a shock. The other one is paired with a shock for 5 trials during the acquisition phase. And of course, these are counterbalanced between subjects. So one, it's not, so we know it's not specific the characteristics of any one or the other. So a conditioned fear is learned towards the reinforced conditioned stimulus, called CS+, relative to the unreinforced conditioned stimulus, called CS-, forming a baseline for learning towards one of the categories. And they were shocked, received electric shock with one exemplar from each category, either one black female and one white female, or if you're in the male target condition, one black male or one white. Any questions? And again, our dependent measure was then once we in fact actually learned a fear response towards a CS+ versus a CS- within each particular race gender category, then we looked in fact actually at the extent to which this conditioned arousal became distinct. And we look at that by measuring the skin conductance response across the last 5 trials of the experiment, where they're only viewing the images without electric shock. And the results are along the following lines. Participants in the female target condition. Conditioned fear towards the racial in-group was not different than conditioned fear towards the racial. These are standard error bars. And as it turns out, neither were they similar, different than baseline. 0 here is actually in fact meaningful, because 0 forms the baseline of this unconditioned stimulus, unreinforced conditioned stimulus. So this is learning that persists above and beyond what you, in a sense, already have towards that kind of like arousal you already have towards that category. And both of these are basically no different. Fear goes completely extinct towards exemplars, both male, both in-group and out-group, when the target's female. This isn't the case when the target is male. Whereas you get, when the male is from the racial in-group, you get, again, no difference than 0. Right? The persistence of conditioned fear during the extinction phase. Again, these are all identical statistically. But you in fact actually get a rather strong effect of persistence of conditioned fear, right? Conditioned arousal, when the target is in fact both male and from a racial outgroup. We found no differences between between black and white subjects. Yeah.
Do you have that outgroup block broken down by the participants' gender?
We had no significant difference between male and female research participants. Women were in fact a little bit more, showed this effect actually a little bit more than men did, but it wasn't statistically significant.
What is the fear extinction resistance mean?
This is extinction phase across the last 5 trials of the experiment.
Right, but what are the units?
What was that?
What does that mean?
This is microsiemens US. It's a technical term for skin conductance response. Yeah.
The
Okay.
data is for all men and women, but just by female versus male target, but it mixes together all men and women.
It's all men and women, right? Essentially, no difference between men and women. However, right, we suspect that this arousal, men and women are getting there through different avenues, right? Different psychological systems producing that persistence of conditioned arousal. So if I were to look at vulnerability to sexual coercion, called VSC, and this in a couple other papers, in the male target condition, women's responses, again, there's mainly behavioral, but some attitudinal items about their, subjective feelings of vulnerability to sexual coercion. Women's responses on that scale corresponded to persistence of conditioned fear during extinction. That was whereas men did kind of went the other way. There was no significant correlation, right, of fear of sexual coercion for participants in the female target conditions. It seemed to be a specifically male target phenomenon, right, and the kind of fear actually was predicted, fear of sexual coercion being specific towards male target, not the female target.
Carl?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I don't understand what the correlation is between the skin conductance of what?
And fear of sexual coercion. So women are fearful about being raped, right? They show a higher resistance to extinction.
Carlos?
Yep.
Does that top correlation differ across the in-group male targets versus the out-group male targets for the female participants who score high on the vulnerability of sexual coercion?
Women, you're saying that the women who score higher fear,
So you're showing me a correlation for female participants on their vulnerability to sexual coercion in terms of their responses.
they're
on
afraid
male
of white
targets.
guys too,
Okay.
but they're afraid of black guys more than they are of white guys.
Right, that's what.
And that difference is a fact.
Okay.
Yeah, I just, I didn't mention this right here. Sorry about that. I should have mentioned it. What I did here actually on the dependent measure, right, is to look at these moderation, right, this moderation by personality dispositions, is subtract one score from the other, right? Because you might imagine if someone's fearful, they could be fearful of both targets, right? And so what we did is we created a different score between your fearfulness towards the in-group versus the out-group male target. And then a difference there as well. And so this is correlation with the difference score. So this is relative to the fear that you might actually have towards an in-group male, which is in fact positive.
So the different score for out-group is the one that's a different score. The others are not different scores?
The different score, this different score from, we took a different score for male targets and a different, different score for female targets.
Right, but only for the out-group.
No, for both. Right.
So what is in-group? So how do you get the different score for the in-group condition?
The difference between that and that.
Huh?
He's saying the different score applies to the correlation with fear of sexual coercion. So this chart, there are no different scores in this
Gotcha,
chart.
gotcha.
Yeah, this is
Sorry.
just a straight reporting of
I'm sorry.
each raw
Okay.
category. And when I create a different score here, right, to say.
Correlate with the, okay, makes a lot of sense to me.
Sorry, I should have clarified. And so you get this effect, right, for relative bias towards in-group versus out-group male, and you don't get the effect for relative bias between in-group and out-group.
Was there any asymmetry, black women with regard to white men versus white women with regard to black men?
Yes. Black women, black women versus with regard to white women, and black men versus with regards to white men.
Black women about as anxious about white men as white women are about black men?
Yes. Yeah. Okay, so with respect to this, again, this rather obtuse and subtle prediction about aggression being primarily a male affair, I mean, in terms of it as in fact actually motivating racial prejudice. What we found was that among males in the male target position, male research participants in the male target position, male participants in male target condition. I'm not gonna show you the slides for female target conditions, they're not significant, they're just all over. In the male target condition, you're gonna see where we in fact have prediction in. For male participants in the male target condition, aggression led to increased resistance to extinction, learned fear towards the out-group relative to the in-group, right? Particularly when social dominance orientation was high. So when social dominance orientation was high and aggression was high, that's where you immediately got the problem.
I'm sorry, how is aggression measured?
Self-report. Mainly behavioral, but self-report. So people who say that they got in a lot of fights or they. And so what we have here is no difference. In fact, it seems to actually be going the wrong way. And what we've got here is, in fact, aggression seemingly predicting this effect. Resistance to extinction condition fear for men and not for women. Suggests this effect for men may not be purely fear. Right? Kind of aggressive agitation. Priming themselves in a sense for readying themselves, right, in an aversive intergroup situation for violent conflict.
Carlos?
Yeah.
Did you do mediation analyses? Did you see that the extinction bias was fully accounted for those, by those individual differences, or do you still get guys who aren't high in SDO and aren't high in aggression
We haven't
still
done that. We haven't.
showing the extinction bias? And I'm
That's
just
a good-
wondering,
yeah.
does that mean that there's only a subset of the guys who are driving your effect, or could there be multiple things going on?
So no, I haven't looked at mediation analyses, but
You can table that.
but I've looked at the data, the raw data, right, on my own. And it does look like this is just a couple guys.
Mhm. It's specifically
5, 6
those
guys,
guys.
especially those guys, right? The rest of the guys, right, they nothing seems to be happening. Now, it's not exactly clear why that might be the case. It might just because they feel both aggression and fear, and the two cancel each other out. And so they might actually have. There's actually a third response system. Actually, a lot of the fear conditioning literature doesn't take any response, and it's actually just freezing and debilitating, right? So you might actually get a situation where you can. A lot of men might just be going just freezing, right? Just whatever. And yeah, either running away, right, nor engaging. The dependent measure, the skin test response isn't that sensitive. We're using other autonomic response measures in our current and future experiments to try to tease that apart. Again, with no subject gender main effect. In a sense, no difference in the basic outcome, but it looks like we've got different predictors predicting that same effect, getting there through different outcomes. Namely, fear of sexual coercion among women and aggression and social dominance. Now, I've got some convergent evidence on that the fear extinction experiment, right, using different measures of racial prejudice. In another study, I looked at two dependent measures. One was negative attitudes towards blacks, general explicit race bias measure. Generally, items are kind of like along the lines of, I'm afraid to look next to blacks, or blacks are bad and scary. And negative attitudes towards Barack Obama, which are items along the lines of like, I like Barack Obama. I don't like Barack Obama. And what we see, as it turns out, this is the explicit bias DV here. These are standardized scores. You actually get, in fact, the same general trend. Again, the primary prediction being here, aggression, particularly when social dominance emerges. When the goal is there are groups who dominate other groups, right? That's paired with, congruent with racial prejudice. In fact, you get a significant result there. And a lot of other data sets I've had too, sometimes in case we get a main effect, you can see here actually there's a main effect for regression as well in this particular DB.
Is that particular graph for people who are negative?
These are for people who are negative towards blacks and things. But that, in other measures, you'll get something like this, where you might even see actually people who are low in social dominance and irritation, but who are very aggressive, right? Not showing any more racial prejudice. But you always see this, right? So this is kind of what I've been finding a lot in most of my data sets. That when aggression predicts prejudice, when subjects also have the goal that their groups are dominated. But this is basically what we replicate across studies, right? High aggression, high social dominance. Which I was pretty surprised to get three-way interactions and the two-way interaction between men, among men to replicate. Usually pretty tough to do, but as it turns out that this was actually much more robust than any one of the variables measured as main effects in the world. So, to some degree, the argument can be made, I don't want to go too much into the line of values and politics, but the argument can be made, some negativity towards Barack Obama is driven by the same side, right, in terms of supporting him and liking him. Brought along the same line, underlying psychology as general race bias. And what we actually seem to be the case of this very learnability to learn to acquire conditioned arousal for men. So aggression, social dominance for men, the two together, the strongest predictor of negativity towards outgroups in general and specific towards a particular outgroup male. Again, white subjects in that subject in that sample. Have some other convergent evidence for that pattern which I described earlier, vulnerability to sexual coercion and this kind of bias between in-group and out-group males. You probably can't see this too well, but here's various, in this study I actually asked specific questions like, I'm afraid of black men, or I'm afraid of white men, right? Same questions towards each target. I'm afraid of black women, I'm afraid of white men, all done within subgroups. Or black men are fearful, white men are fearful, white females, women are fearful, right? And what we in fact actually had is a rather consistent correlation with between vulnerability to sexual coercion. Right? Just look at these ones here, and fear of black men. This is white subjects. I did measure general fear in that one, which is actually the fear measurement of things like spiders and snakes. That also correlated with these measures. However, when I put these all in multiple regression, multivariate, with several dependent measures, a black male dependent measure, white male dependent measure, a female dependent measure, and a white female dependent measure. As it turns out, the only one that in fact remains significant after covering out the effects of general fear is fear of black men. And the details of that are in this paper. I don't want to go into the details of that. But we seem to actually be getting, general fear, of course, correlates with fear of outgroup males. But we seem to actually get some unique variants being explained by specifically fear of sexual coercion. Yeah.
Was the general fear question just about non-human things like snakes and spiders?
It's mainly non-human stuff. Yeah. You might imagine, of course, the systems are going to be overlapping. It's going to be, right before there was intergroup conflict, right? You might imagine there was fear systems that are designed to avoid dangerous agents. Outgroup members start becoming categorized as dangerous agents, and so you're going to get some overlaps there. So we do in fact actually have overlap, but when you covary out the two, one versus the other, you still get some specific variants being explained by fear of rape among them. Okay, I'm going to describe some results that are relevant to menstrual cycle effects.
Before you go on the
Yeah.
previous page, what about black women?
Didn't have enough of them in this study, like 6 of them.
I'm sorry, did you say that's only
This is
women?
only one.
Only women?
Yeah, pretty
Only
sorry.
black women, yeah.
Okay, so as most of us are well familiar with, conception risk varies across the cycle. Costs of sexual coercion, as you might imagine, should be highest when conception risk is likely. Conception risk is unlikely. Right? Cost of something like sexual coercion might only have issues to do with reputational damage and whatnot. Specifically damage, right, towards the viability of one's offspring, as much as it would be the case if you've got if a woman is sexually coerced when conception risk is high. There's some evidence out there that suggests that women seem to be particularly sensitive to situations or individuals who they might appraise as having a high probability of being in danger for sexual coercion, such as thinking that men that they've never seen before, or suspect or be rapists, and some behavioral evidence that there's reduced mobility levels time. Certain extent where that's been replicated. But there's some, again, evidence consistent, pre-existing evidence consistent with this notion. So, with respect to how this anti-sexual coercion system in women might be relevant to the psychology of race bias, we think that this coercion avoidance system may in fact may lead women to become more negative, right, towards men belonging to the dangerous category. And certainly Black American males fit that bill. And you can get there, right, either by using socially transmitted information, both knowledge about how Black men are racists or are rapists, right, if that knowledge structure is there, or through near outgroup heuristics, right, regardless of stereotypes existing. I'm agnostic as to the fact which of these, well, I'm a little less agnostic, I won't tell you actually which side I seem to kind of lean towards for women, but maybe towards the end. But you can imagine that either socially transmitted information could be used, or in-group outgroup heuristics, right, who's in and who's out, could be used as information, right, as decision rules in which women can therefore, when they're likely to become pregnant, could then think of the individuals from those particular categories should be avoided, disliked, whatnot. In either way, whether it's stereotypes are activating the system or outgroup heuristics. Among white women, you might imagine Black women are categorized as one of these dangerous agents, right? Particularly putting women at risk for sexual coercion. So, I think our prediction for the study was along the lines as follows: race bias will rise as a function of perceived vulnerability to sexual coercion, particularly when conception risk is high. So we've kind of established, right, previous study, perceived vulnerability to sexual coercion that correlates with race bias. We think actually this is particularly ramped up, right? Two are put together, high conception risk and perceived vulnerability to sexual coercion. Two together should produce the highest levels of race bias normally populated. So we ran a study to test this basic idea. We used 77 white women, mainly 18 and 19-year-olds, a few women over that, who at least said they were not using contraceptives. You took a couple of surveys and reaction time tests to measure their levels of explicit and implicit bias, race bias. 5 different measures. 5 different measures I'll talk about in a second. With respect to the independent variable, of course, we used a fear of rape scale we described before, and we calculated conception risk along Wilcox model, asking women when their last menstrual cycle was, asking them before that, and then inferring how long their menstrual cycle is, and inferring actually what stage of the menstrual cycle they're in. And these values, this comes from, we actually get these values, in fact, actually using a metric from actuarial data from medical literature, in which women are in fact assigned a probability between 0 and 1, right? 0 and 0.1. I think it's actually 0.13 or something. That's probably not quite right. Approaching 0 when you're very unlikely to get pregnant, and approaching 0.13 when you're more likely to get pregnant if you're in fact having sex, and not on the pill. So these dependent measures of race bias, we used an explicit measure, general negative attitudes towards blacks. These are a couple of the items. I would rather not have black people living in the same apartment building as I avoid. With respect to implicit race bias, again, this is a measure of non-conscious bias, for the most part non-conscious bias. Difficult to fake measure of race bias, which is using a commonly used implicit association test where participants are expected to react towards images on a computer screen with paired towards words like good or bad. In the case of an evaluation type of implicit association test, and we look at the extent to which they can associate white faces with the words good, like good, or black faces with words like bad, or other similarly valence words. And so the difference between the extent to which they can have faster associations among, towards white targets, the white subjects, relative to black targets with good and bad words, is in fact their measure of implicit non-conscious racial prejudice. We use another implicit association test called stereotyping, IAT, that are not as heavily valenced as the items that we used in what we call the evaluative IAT, which is looking at the pure stereotyping of the type, so not necessarily good or bad valence, it's just stereotyping. So words like brainy, right, or mental, right, how fast people make those kinds of associations with parts of one, and physical, right, or words like basketball or boxing or something like this. Some aspect of physicality, to what extent people can associate those things quicker with white faces versus black faces. Of course, most people associate good words with their own race and bad words with another race more readily. And the same seems to be true with certain kinds of stereotyping, like the physical versus mental, or physical versus mental dichotomy. People, white subjects in particular, are more likely to associate black faces with words with physicality rather than being mental. We actually had a, what's that, 1, 2, 3, 4, explicit race, 1, 2, 3, 4. Here's our, okay, that's right, I had an attraction measure, fear. So in one of our measures we used pictures of these avatars. There are 2D representations of 3D avatars that we constructed, where they're identical in terms of build, muscle structure, facial structure, other than things like lip, whiteness of lips, nose, hairstyles, and of course skin color. And subjects saw both white and black males. I'm not sure why we insisted on having them not clothed. But
Show their muscularity.
I think it was Dan.
Just to show their muscularity.
We said, look, there's an intergroup encounter and there's, sexual coercion in the air. It might have been, I think this might have been something like we didn't want to cover up their, I think they had like really preppy clothes or something. I don't know. To show their musculature. And we asked questions like, to what extent do you think this person was scary? We also used, we created a really short measure that had a couple of items along the lines of, again, looking at these, when you're looking at participants are looking at these faces, looking at these torsos, I guess, face torsos. To what extent do you think this person is sexy, right? To what extent do you think this person is handsome? So 5 measures: explicit race bias, general race bias. These are all using male, the rest actually all using male targets only. Implicit negative evaluation of affect, and an implicit race bias, knowledge of stereotypes or accessibility of the stereotype, fear of outgroup males, and then to what extent they're attracted to males from outgroup versus in-group. Yeah, I should have made this bigger. This is descriptive data from the conception risk variable on, let's see, on our DVs and our IV, that's right. So it doesn't correlate with the IV, and we actually had a positive correlation, significant correlation of 4 out of the 5. Implicit bias, implicit stereotyping bias, race bias and beta attraction, and fear of outgroup males, and a marginal effect for explicit race bias. Yeah, we might have expected this to be the case. This is not gender specific. Although when I actually tried replicating it, this fact replicated significantly on a much larger sample. Okay, if we were just going to look now, just the basic data, again, without using our explicit prediction being fear of sexual coercion is going to lead to greater race bias on these kind of heavily male gendered racial preferences. And how that's going to be predicted by fear of sexual coercion, particularly when conception risk is high, right? That's the primary prediction. So I'm showing you interesting and rather striking data, right, that I kind of didn't really expect to find results this striking. But here it is. So when we plot conception risk using our data, again, using the sexuality table, where each subject gets has a conception risk value based on what day of the cycle they are. It looks at just about what the textbook stage. Across the menstrual cycle, around mid-cycle, conception risk peaks for women. Right? That's the distribution across the menstrual cycle of conception risk.
Carlos?
Yeah.
I'm confused when you said it looks like the textbook. You're not measuring conception risks. What do you mean it looks like?
This is measuring conception. So when women are in the 50, they have high conception risk value.
But it is textbook data, right?
It's textbook data.
So we didn't measure conception risk, we measured position in the cycle, and then we assigned.
Inferred conception risk.
Right, so,
Okay.
yeah. But what he means by the textbook is everyone says it's concentrated in the middle of the cycle,
Okay.
and the obstetrics literature say, yes, it is concentrated in the middle of the cycle. That's what he means by it.
Okay.
It looks like the textbook.
This isn't in textbooks yet. What we got here is race bias having a rather strong fit with conception risk across the menstrual cycle. When you put all these race, implicit and explicit race bias variables into one composite variable, and map that, standardize it, and map that on the y-axis, and you plot cycle day among our research participants, what you get is an increase in race bias mid-cycle, and then drop it back off. They generally lower at both ends. Yeah.
And you have fear of other things, or,
In this study we don't. This study is only fear of sexual.
so you don't know if this is specific to race or if it's general fear of everything.
They weren't fearful of white men, right? It was differential between white and black faces.
Yeah, so,
But we don't know this.
yeah. So when I actually wrote this down by these measures here in particular, race bias and mate attraction, and race bias and outgroup males, right? I haven't scored for men, for white men, but as it turns out, some of this in fact is driven, at least in part, by less fear of white men.
I just wonder if you get the same curve if you asked about fear of spiders. In other words, we don't know.
Well, I tried replicating these results, I didn't get it. Except, this is before I actually used the general fear.
The red line is a difference between fear depending on the target, right?
That's right.
So that's important in answering.
Yeah, they're not more fearful of white males. And on the scale itself, the fear of race scale, they're not more fearful in general towards the items. They don't say that they're more fearful. It seems to be, although I haven't empirically ruled out anything. I think so. Good.
Yeah, I mean, I guess one of the questions is, women might have a race bias, and then that gets accentuated at peak conception risk, and then the question is, are there other, do we know if other things get accentuated at peak conception risk or not? Not necessarily fear of spiders, but other
That would be
kinds
hard
of
to
fears.
predict actually why conception risk predict those things.
Right, you wouldn't
I
predict
mean,
that, but
you
that's why you
I
want to
mean,
have
you
that
could
data.
imagine though that the system would bring those things up along with it. We do know that fear of race and fear of other kind of things are correlated. If we got an increase in those kinds of things, it would be inconsistent with it.
Right,
That
just-
it would be, sort of, we'd be able to argue for less specificity, right, of the outcome.
But you can make a very strong argument if you show that fear of spiders or fear of, getting hit by a car doesn't cause.
Right.
that
You
would be
just,
very
it's just
powerful.
data you'd, I was interested in
Yeah,
wondering whether
yeah.
you have or not.
Yeah.
Did you say though that?
We're doing exactly just that in virtual reality experiments, to do all kinds of manipulations.
With fear of dogs.
We just don't have it yet. We've got dogs, we've got cows, it's gonna be a while before we see data.
Fear of sexual assault did not, but that on its own did not.
That on its own did not rise.
So that's.
Yeah. It's just in the way that women are using that information.
Well, there's this balance between kind of, extroversion and sensation seeking that seems to rise mid-cycle, consistent with kind of a, not in these data, but in other data. Going out and meeting new men, as it were, and this concern about the costs of being vulnerable.
So you guys are, you guys are asking a lot of really sophisticated questions. Usually when I present my data, I kind of have to try to keep things as simple as possible because, things get really complicated. I have some data, and we in fact presented it at a conference once, right? That shows that this effect is in fact suggests that what was your name again?
Tage.
Tage, I was gonna say Taj. Tage mentioned that, women could already be biased, and then it ramps up, right, using that information ramps that up. We have some evidence that's consistent with that. In fact, some evidence actually that shows it's crucially consistent with that. So when we measure pure stereotyping, right, in replications and negative feelings towards them. So you can actually have a stereotype about black guys, not feel negatively about them. But if you know the stereotype, right, you get this effect that's ramped up on negative feelings towards black men. If you haven't internalized the stereotype of black men as being particularly physical, what we actually find is some effect going in the opposite direction. In fact, women becoming less negative towards black men. So the least prejudiced women are becoming less negative or more positive towards black men. It's kind of an interesting story because when we originally started this experiment, we had dual competing predictions about what are we going to find. Are we going to get women actually becoming less prejudiced, or are we going to have men becoming more prejudiced, right? And as it looks actually is that in our replications of this is that we actually have evidence for both. Again, this has been reviewed, peer reviewed, and none of this has been published, of course. So I'm kind of reticent in actually making it my story, make it too big of a thing. Because someone could point out, oh, you did this expert thing wrong, and I look stupid. So this suggests, right, that this is something actually that can happen among women, in fact, actually have internalized the stereotypes. We're also running an experiments we're looking at for these effects just purely on minimal groups, using implicit association tests on number of groups. Right? There's no content there. Red shirts versus blue shirts, right? Having subjects wear a red shirt or a blue shirt. Haven't analyzed it yet. But yeah, you can see how you can have predictions going both ways, right? This is really describing something that occurs for something. At least in the study, though, we've got some really killer effects. We're kind of sort of describing this as being really fun and cool. Again, the more nuanced prediction, women high on conception risk, vulnerability to sexual coercion, right? High on vulnerability to sexual coercion, particularly when conception risk is high, have the largest effect, right, of race bias when you collapse all these race bias measures together. So even orthogonally to the notion of whether women, some women are racist, some are not, some internalize stereotype, and some haven't, you're already getting a large individual difference. Whereas women who don't fear rape, don't see themselves as being vulnerable, particularly vulnerable to sexual coercion, aren't being more negative to black guys. This is not considered a significant difference. Aren't being more negative towards black guys. There seems to actually be a slew of very careful decision rules that women are using. Am I vulnerable? Right? Is the target, how much information, right, negative information on the target? Is he formidable? Right? Am I vulnerable? Is he formidable? That actually seems to underline these effects. Computations of their own formidability, right? Vulnerability, computations of the formidability of the target, and their conception risk actually predict these effects. You might imagine if things were the other way around, right? They're not particularly feeling vulnerable, or they don't have negative stereotypes about the outgroup, you could get the opposite effects. Right? Again, in these studies actually we don't get the opposite effect here, but other studies we in fact actually do get. You usually have to go with these two standard deviations to be able to get positivity effects. Right? But we get current.
You can defer this to later, but this VSC scale,
yeah,
presumably that's anchored to something in the real world rather than the woman's perception of her risk.
Well, it's all self-reported, so.
No, I know that, but I'm just wondering, do we know what drives women to vary on their VSC in general, not in your study?
When they've been raped, they are more likely to show high vulnerability to sexual coercion. I can't necessarily say from the clinical literature. I can shock them, I can't ask them. It's fine. Okay. That's a general idea. It's explained by interaction between individual difference variables and conceptions, as you might expect. I'm curious and very eager actually to start analyzing our existing data we just got on minimal groups and looking at more extensively larger data sets where we carefully parse out negative feelings towards information and stereotypes about the other group to see to what extent actually we can consistently find antagonistic effects depend on individual differences. Being less depressing story, I think, if we can establish that. Okay, Barack Obama, how's he relative to this? Did we want to get food? Did the food get delivered?
Unfortunately, we're not going to get food, so sorry to everyone about that. But,
Riot!
seems like
Good day for course evaluations, that's nice.
Yeah, let's save that for next week. My apologies, but
Yeah.
apparently the guy locked his keys in his truck.
Oh, that's having an even worse day.
So he's having a bad day. So, sorry about that, but 21 minutes.
You should have asked for doing it.
Okay. We'll name the tips. Okay, so onward. Barack Obama, how might it be relevant to Barack Obama? Barack Obama, his persona, his public face shows, you might be arguing, conflicting cues for both approach and avoidance. He's black, multiracial, but he's categorized most people as black. He says himself that he's black. Both attraction, right? I'm assuming, I don't know if anybody's measured it, that he's showing cues.
Yes,
No.
he's attractive.
But he's also black, okay, so we all know that women who are more attracted to, it's a function of conception risk, cancer and high testosterone men, and at least with data that I've coming out more negative towards scary type, dangerous types, like black guys, guys who are unfamiliar, these kind of. Of course, he evinces some of these cues of genetic equality, both in terms of him being physically attractive and high testosterone. These are unscientifically culled from literature, from the New York Times during fall 2008. And the physicality of the show as well. And
We didn't take his clothes off.
that was, yeah. That's not doctored. Your president really is that sexy. He's okay. At the same time, he's black, and that people's explicit mental representations of him might be, yep, Barack Obama's black. He's the first black president. At maybe some operative, unconscious levels, perhaps he's internalizes not being all that black. Represents not being all that black because he's such a powerful counter-stereotypic example of the black male. These are words actually getting towards the. Yeah, but yeah, that was probably the doctor.
Is that doctor?
Yeah, I'm sure it was. Right. These kinds of things might load high on some kind of neural network factor of whiteness. Right? Having a high Ivy League education, being the president of the United States, getting more white than that. Right? Yeah, and generally tries to be listening personally, non-controversial, and acts cool. Right? Doesn't get all worked up. Even some even say more cool than ultra white when it's actually in fact becoming. Not getting people's faces. Such that Chris Matthews now infamously stating after his last Barack Obama's last human address, I forgot the guy was black. He's so articulate, so wonderful. I thought he was white. Okay. As an exemplar of good genes, and his power, his good looks. Obama's attractiveness and dominance should in fact act as a cue for increased liking and support, but only to the extent that he is not perceived as belonging to the dangerous category of black. You might imagine that people who might, as a function of conception risk, maybe like him more, but the fact that he's black actually might bring it out. You can get it washed out. Doesn't stop me from running the experience. We made a prediction women would be more likely to support Barack Obama, say that they would in fact be willing to vote for him. I saddle up to the big guy. Willing to vote for him when conception risk is high. If in fact it's the case that this suite is more powerful, that his whiteness or something, that unleashes like these other aspects of gender equality is more powerful than the fact that he's black. More specifically, we thought to again help pin down the mechanisms actually what might be driving these effects. If we got in fact that effect, we predicted that risk perception should in fact not be political support for Barack Obama, such that when conception risk is high and they categorize him or perceive him as being more white than black, right? as conception risk increases, the more likely they should be more in fact likely to support Barack Obama. But that the exact opposite should be the case, to the extent that they think he's more black than white. That conception risk, in fact, would lead to a decrease in intent to vote for Obama. So again, we use this as a tool to see to what extent we could get no main effect. Right? But among individual differences, women who actually categorize as being white, predict we might be able to find that they support him more, and women who categorize as being black, we might find that they support him less, regardless of whether or not there's a main effect. But if most people perceive him as white, then we in fact think of a main effect should emerge. So we ran 2 studies independently and concomitantly on one at MSU, Michigan State University, and the other on the web. It's a broader sample. We used normally ovulating women. Study dates were between August and election day 2008. Independent variables were along the lines that I just described, the Wilcox method for step inferring conceptual. And with study 3B, this is the one actually on the larger sample, the internet study, we in fact gave subjects a perceptual bias task to be used as a measure of to the extent to which they thought that he was more white than black, regardless of whether or not they explicitly say it. So both in fact actually measuring preference for Barack Obama when conception risk is high, but the second study measuring, trying to cut down the mechanism, measuring to what extent this effect could be driven by perceptions of him as being more white than black, or black than white. And how we broke down the dependent measures, we asked, which candidate do you prefer, Barack Obama, John McCain, another candidate, or no candidate. And we broke them down into 0 and 1, preference for Obama versus preference for other candidates. If they had no preference or were not going to vote, we could use it. Yeah. So the dependent variable now is binary, 0 or 1. 1 if they say that they're going to vote for Barack Obama, 0 for anybody else. So with respect to the main effect, when we use conception risk as a predictor of willingness to say that they're going to vote for Barack Obama, we in fact actually had a significant correlation between conception risk and preference for voting for Barack Obama. Willingness or desire to vote for Barack Obama.
All white women?
All white women. I think the internet study includes some non-white, most of them. The MSU study is all white. NOC study also actually we asked women after the study when their next menstrual cycle was, and they reported back, and we could kind of triangulate on it. Made no difference, but kind of tighten things up. Rather small effect, but again, statistically significant. Okay, women preferring Barack Obama when conception was preferring to say those more likely to vote. And again, to look at the extent to which race perception might modulate this effect, what we did is we created a swatch, colored swatch, and presented it as embedded within the questionnaires we gave research participants on the web. And what we did is we sampled 50 internet images, Barack Obama, top 50 that appeared on Google and Yahoo search engines, cut out eyes and hair off those images, and then got pure skin images and created a composite skin color tone image for Barack Obama. And what we did is we lightened that skin tone up, right, a few steps up, and lightened that and darkened that skin tone down a few steps down, with the true Barack Obama's color as being featured in the center swatch. Well, I already gave it away. That's the real Barack Obama's skin tone. Okay, as it turns out, participants seem to pretty consistently over-perceive the extent to which he was light versus dark. The average actually was about 6.2 for our participants. Suggesting there's something to this where folks actually think that he's in fact lighter than he really might be. But here's the defining issue here. We're hoping to pin down, again, he's described some data that can help us pin down the mechanism. If you were looking at the intention to vote for Barack Obama on the white axis, the probability of saying that you're going to vote for him versus not, and you're going to plot the predicted log-odds ratio of their subjects' willingness to say that they vote for him across the menstrual cycle. What it looks to be the case is when they actually are on the side where they say he's in fact more black than white, right? So the left side more black than white, you in fact actually get a trend towards less willingness to vote for, say you're going to vote for Barack Obama. When you think that he's lighter than his skin tone is, you in fact actually get the opposite effect, an antagonistic effect. Most subjects are in this line, so we in fact actually got a main effect, but you might imagine this is consistent in a sense actually with those two lines of menstrual cycle research that I was telling you about. Those who are categorized as dangerous agents, right? Less preference for them. Those categorized as guys like you, sexy, right? That gets unleashed greater preference for them. So it's kind of in a sense of an application, those two lines of research within a single example. For what we think is a real reasonable, important event measure, voting for the President of the United States. This is a rather descriptive graph. We actually looked at to what extent this effect could be caused by conservative women versus liberal women. When we plot these out, so the red lines are conservative women, blue lines are liberal women. The effect actually seems to be primarily driven by the conservative women, probably very likely only because we got a ceiling effect here. All liberal women already like it.
So for the re-election, you are going to actually try and do this with real votes?
We'd have, yeah, that's going to be tough. We'd have to get people after because we're not.
You would have to get people.
Nobody's gonna get, he's gonna try to get everybody in sync.
That's right.
Herd them up and. Yeah. No, it would be interesting to, yeah, we should do this before and after, right?
Yeah, I mean, you just have to get women to participate in your study soon after the election so they can get their actual vote.
I have some data.
I mean, if you want to impress the political scientists, then that's the,
I have some data.
or do exit polling.
The thing is, though, is that the tough thing is that right before the election, you can use women all the way from August or even further, saying who they're going to vote for. After that, you need to sample a bunch of women right after that because they start forgetting or they start saying it's a whole bunch of things, and then the accuracy actually, in fact, backdating it too. I don't know. Yeah, that's where someone didn't fund actually an extension of this because of that thought. That's a good idea. I need to do that. They mentioned that you're not studying real behavior because it's an intention to vote. Yeah, I need to do that. I should do that. Yeah.
That effect is humongous for the conservative women at peak conceptualists. I mean, you're doubling the odds of voting for Obama.
Sure.
Is that I don't know anything about political voting behavior, but is that typical that you have effects like that can just double or have it?
No.
I would think
The biggest predictor of political attitude is the same way you're the conservative voter. That's the main question.
There's regression lines,
Regression.
so it's not clearly linear. I mean, you're fitting the line, but the effects might not be that big at the end of the line.
Right.
Yeah.
But it's not linear, it's logistic. Right? It's already,
True.
Yeah, but it's still forcing them to this could be like this.
Yeah.
Okay, to summarize. Changes, so what do you got here? Changes in target preferences, you know, both positive and negatives as a function of fertility.
Carlos, you have a question first.
Yeah, yeah.
So is there a difference by political persuasion about how white you think Barack is?
No, we thought there would be.
So that's interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah. Well, I think we're done. Right. This is. Yeah. Sex differences and prejudice actually seems to be consistent. It's consistent, or that's consistent with the notion. Prejudice is consistent with the idea that there are separate psychological systems for aggression, fear, sort of overlapping, but men are primarily enlisting aggression mechanism for when they express racial prejudice, women primarily enlisting fear system when they express prejudice, particularly fear of sexual conversion. So with that, thanks for listening.